Good afternoon. You're listening to In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska, broadcasting from Melbourne, Australia. This is a series dedicated to the Macedonian question, and we are covering Professor Dr. Igor Janev's scholarly paper titled The PRESPA Agreement as Cultural Genocide of the Macedonian National Identity Towards the Termination of an Illegal Treaty. In our previous broadcast, we commenced to cover Chapter 5 of this book. And we did the first section of Chapter 5. We are attempting to keep these segments short so that you are able to follow the content of this scholarly paper. We are going to continue with Chapter 5, 5.1 in particular. For 10 days in June of 2022, the Macedonian population protested against the French proposal until finally the protocol between the two ministers for foreign affairs was endorsed by the parliamentary majority headed by the Social Democrats, that is the SDSM, in a pretty much forced out manner, says Professor Igor Janev. Protests of Macedonian people were at some moments violent, but the huge police presence and decisive, brutal actions forcefully established order around the parliament and other government buildings and institutions. The government headed by SDSM and the Albanian party DUI, as well as the European Union officials on their side, claimed the proposal was a, in quotation, good step forward. Furthermore, they claim that it is, in quotation, only opportunity. It's the only opportunity, end of quotation, for Macedonia to open such negotiations. At this point, it should be noted that the voting for the French proposal in Parliament was even more dubious since the documents presented were incomplete. And particularly that was the case with the hidden protocol concluded later between both the ministers for foreign affairs, for which the government launched misperception to this in not a part or annex 2 of the French proposal. At the session, the members of parliament actually voted only for one page short government report or information on the protocol related to the French proposal, with lack of crucial information for the decision-making process. The Macedonian MPs didn't have vital information or even basic knowledge of the alleged differences in the text of the French proposal's revisions and the protocol. In addition, they were uninformed about the content of the unilateral declaration of Bulgaria attached to the protocol and thus the French proposal. Wow. How can this be so? How can this be so? Unlike in the Macedonian members of parliament, text of the protocol and both unilateral declarations, that is the Macedonian and the Bulgarian, were fully known to the Bulgarian MPs and most of the public there. So in other words, in Bulgaria, the Bulgarian people knew about this. The Bulgarian members of parliament also knew about it, but it was a hidden secret in Macedonia. The Macedonian people didn't know anything about it. The members of parliament didn't know anything about it. Did the Minister of Foreign Affairs know? Did the United States of America know? Did the European Union know? I think you know the answer to that. But they kept it hush-hush. Yes, you can tell on whose side they are, the so-called strategic partners. Unlike the Macedonian members of parliament, the text of the protocol and both unilateral declarations, Macedonian and Bulgarian, were fully known to the Bulgarian members of parliament and most of the public in Bulgaria. Strikingly, on the day when a decision on the French proposal in the Macedonian parliament was scheduled to take place, the president of the European Union, you've seen her, Ursula von der Leyen visited Skopje, and she invited herself and addressed the parliament. Really? Openly suggesting urging MPs to vote in favor of the French proposal. How desperate is the European Union to make these changes that are to the detriment of the people of Macedonia and the country we've always known since antiquity as Macedonia. She was in the Macedonian parliament encouraging people to vote, encouraging members of parliament to vote in favor of the French proposal. French proposal being the European proposal. Of course, she supports it. There's no opposition from the United States of America or any other such country. Tells a lot, doesn't it? Similar support, or rather unusual pressure, from the European Union and the USA had been manifested days before a decision in the parliament was delivered. There we go. Professor writes. Furthermore, Macedonian MPs were informed by the government that regardless of their decision in the parliament, the protocol will be signed anyway, and the French proposal will be accepted. This sounds like an ultimatum. Yeah, the only solution, isn't it? The European Union and the United States of America, only solution. It will be signed anyway, and the French proposal would be accepted. So then why vote? Why did Ursula von der Leyen come to Macedonia? Why was she allowed to go into the parliament? Who is she? She's got no standing in Macedonia whatsoever. Maybe not in the European Union either. But anyway, they're stuck with her for the time being. So would be signed anyway, and the French proposal will be accepted, since this course of action was in quote, in exclusive jurisdiction of the executive branch of the government. Really? So even if Parliament failed to give the endorsement, the French proposal will still be accepted and the protocol will be signed regardless of the vote. What a democracy. Therefore, as anyone can conclude with respect to this unusual situation, voting in the Macedonian parliament that took place was only a charade to satisfy the so-called democratic criteria, or to play of democracy. The decision was already made before the voting, and the Macedonian people were deceived, by the government once again, the government and their supporters. During the voting on the information on the protocol, all opposition parties in the Macedonian parliament boycotted the process. They boycotted it. Clearly, a decision to accept the French proposal with the protocol was strikingly against the people's will. Crucial part in that charade played the Speaker of the Parliament, T. Jaferi, an Albanian from Kosovo with a checkered criminal history. This is my commentary, proving once again that he has a special role in the autocratic process related to nullification of the Macedonian nation and division of the Macedonian territory. Ulterior motives. In the document of the European Union so-called proposal published by government, page 3, we found deliberately vague formulations stating that the quotation regarding the translations of the acquis into Macedonian, the European Union took note of Bulgaria and North Macedonia's respective unilateral declarations on the Macedonian language, end of quote. Therefore, the European Union, in fact, didn't accept a clear formulation on language and essentially failed to recognize the Macedonian language as such. At this point, we need to remind you that the Macedonian language was recognized by the UN in 1977. With respect to the Macedonian position on the matter of the language that was supposed to be closed in 1977, the European Union formulation was entirely unacceptable, since it represented a reopening, or rather creation, of a new European Union-sponsored dispute, in quotation dispute, on the closed matter. In this unilateral declaration attached to the French proposal, Bulgarian government openly stated that the Bulgarian side would never never recognized the Macedonian language as an independent, thus intentionally creating a new dispute on language, now recognized as such in the framework of the European Union, that needs to be resolved, says the professor. Similarly, the Bulgarians accomplished to create, or they were successful in creating a so-called dispute on history and identity in general that appears to become a legitimate issue in the European Union and the new conditions for European membership. How so? How can this be so? In conclusion, the French proposal, combined with the mentioned protocol as it part and both unilateral declarations, created an artificial and illegal dispute on cultural national identity, accepted as a legitimate dispute in the EU, which has to be resolved in the path towards membership. Once again, Bulgarian government openly demanded that the Macedonians must declare themselves as Bulgarians, otherwise they wouldn't let this country to obtain a membership in the negotiations with the EU. Ultimatums, bribes, ultimatums. What? They're supposed to be a democratic country and members of the European Union, which are, its membership is countries that are allegedly democratic, so they claim. Apparently, the European Union in its policy didn't take into consideration that sovereign national rights embedded in the Charter of the United Nations must be respected. These sovereign rights and freedoms contain also cultural sovereignty and sovereign equality that seems to be unknown or completely rejected or neglected, I should say, by the European Union policymakers that couldn't understand that a nation may not be a subject of foreign or imposed forceful assimilation. Remarkably, from the previous discussion, it appears that the Western international community tend to reshape fundamental principle of sovereignty in the world arena, a principle that is the main pillar of international law. More generally, Western powers, or the so-called international community, in a number of small or weak countries, such as those in the Western Balkans, systematically and intentionally ignored, neglected, and negated that fundamental pillar principle of international law. As was seen in the case of the Macedonian identity, cultural independence became a joke after implicitly proclaiming that sovereignty was less important for Macedonian or the Macedonians, and after demonstrated tolerance by EU for the open and imposed forceful assimilation against national identity of Macedonians conducted by the Bulgarian government. It appears that the so-called, in quotes, international community, end of quote, that represent a synonym for Western community of developed, so-called developed countries, headed by the United States of America and the European Union, established a new political doctrine of ignorance for the principle of sovereignty in general. All efforts of the so-called international community aim to diminish the value of that fundamental principle of international law, actually endorsed emerging of a new rules and a political principle of being legitimate to intervene in domestic affairs of all countries in the world for different suitable reasons. In the case of Macedonia, as we demonstrated throughout this publication thus far, after the PRESPA agreement, this country is stripped from the basic sovereignty as an element of statehood, is not anymore the same international subject. The newly created republic, so-called the Republic of North Macedonia, after the PRESPA agreement, is less than the state in proper legal terms. And so we end 5.1, that is 5.1, chapter 5.1 of the PRESPA agreement as a cultural genocide of the Macedonian national identity towards the termination of an illegal treaty by Professor Dr. Igor Janev. Thank you for listening to In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska. I'm looking forward to seeing you shortly again.